So thank you really much for attending this Just Transition webinar. My name is Jean-Jacques Barbéris. I'm working at Amundi, and I'm also the Vice Chairman of Finance for Tomorrow. It's a great pleasure to host this webinar today. And the objective of this webinar is to discuss a concept that starts to be, I would say, more and more important for investors in the financial industry, which is the concept of just or fair transition. And so we have recently at Finance for Tomorrow published a position paper regarding what the actors of Place de Paris are thinking about this concept and how they position themselves vis-à-vis the concept, and also more importantly, what they will do to implement the concept in their investment decisions. And so the objective of this webinar today is to discuss that and to go a little bit in details. So in terms of, I would say, organization, we have 1 hour and 30 minutes ahead of us. Which is long. So if we have one ultimate ambition is to keep you all with us until the end. For the French participants, at least we are not going to hijack the announcements made by the President tonight. So it's a way to, it's in a way we are going to use this afternoon to think about things that we can do and we can achieve on the ground before being locked down all in home again. So today we are going to have a session that will be organized the following. First, I will have the pleasure to introduce the participants. Then afterwards, we will have the huge pleasure of a keynote speech by one of them, Fiona, in particular. And then afterwards, we will enter into, I would say, a virtual roundtable with the different participants. So the participants that we have today, so we have, we're supposed to have Anne-Claire Roux, the Managing Director of Finance for Tomorrow. I think she'll join us at some point in time. She's not there yet. We have Fiona Reynolds with us. Hi, Fiona. It's a pleasure to have you. So I think I don't need to introduce you, but just in case, CEO for the PRIs. We have Nick Robbins, London School of Economics. I think, Nick, you're well known to a number of the Finance for Tomorrow members, as last year you were one of the main speakers on the fair transition questions that was at the heart of the Climate Finance Day in Paris. So it's a great pleasure to have you with us. We have Sabine Lochmann from Vigeo Eiris, that we have also with us, President of Vigeo Eiris. Hello, Sabine. It's a pleasure to have you. We have Marco, I don't know if I will use it the Italian way, but Marco Cilento, that's the way to pronounce it properly. Great. Head of Institutional Policy at European Trade Union Congress, because we do believe it's extraordinarily valuable to discuss that topic with a representative of the unions. We have Adrienne Horel-Pagès from La Banque Postale Asset Management. And we have finally Vincent Tillier, Head of Public Affairs at SFIL. Vincent, so no offense, Vincent, but for those who don't know what SFIL is a public institution in France that is in particular in charge to provide financing solutions for local authorities. That's a good way to present you, Vincent? Cool, great. So I think today the ambition is again to explore the concept of just transition and what we can do about it. I think here, why is it important to discuss that at the moment? For a number of reasons. First, because I think we all see that on the market, on the ESG market at large, we see that there is a very strong interest at the moment since the beginning of the COVID crisis in particular on the social question, the S that used to be, I would say, the lost parent of ESG is now becoming more and more important for investors. And in a way, the just transition or the fair transition is just the integration of the E and the S at the same time. So that's the first reason why it's important to discuss that today. The second reason is that the very concept of fair transition is very much at the heart of the Green Deal. And I think we're going to have some conversation about that, but this is one of the key elements of the Green Deal that had been announced by the European Commission President. And finally, why is it important? Because generally speaking, the very definition of fair transition will explain that. We strongly believe at Finance for Tomorrow that there won't be transition if not socially acceptable, and if not made socially acceptable. And so the questions, what can investors do about it? By definition, the fair transition question is clearly a very, I would say, important topic for policymakers. But the idea of this webinar today is how us as investors, as bankers, our financial market participants, what can we do about that? And so the ambition today is to discuss these elements. To launch, I would say, the conversation, and before the intervention of Fiona, if I'm not mistaken, we have a little video to show. So I'm going to ask Pierre-Alix to start the video right now.
Transition socialement acceptable par l'ensemble des sociétés.
Le monde financier, les investisseurs doivent se mobiliser dans cette transition, mais ils doivent davantage intégrer dans leurs critères ESG les indicateurs sociaux, parce qu'il n'y aura pas de transition écologique digne de ce nom si elle n'est pas juste.
Il y a urgence. La crise climatique est déjà en cours. Les répercussions attendues ont des conséquences majeures dans le monde et chez nous. En France, dès 2050, 1 million de personnes seront concernées par une inondation chaque année. Les inégalités climatiques sont criantes. 10% les plus riches de la population mondiale sont responsables de 52% des émissions de CO2. Les politiques en faveur de la transition ont un coût social.
La crise sociale qui va aboutir et qui a déjà abouti à des licenciements, à la fermeture de sites, va nécessiter une prise en main très radicale de l'accompagnement de cette transition énergétique parce que sinon des pans entiers de notre économie et donc de territoires, de communautés, de personnes vont se retrouver du jour au lendemain sans travail, sans accompagnement.
Les acteurs de la place de Paris s'engagent sur la transition juste.
Pour favoriser la transformation des systèmes financiers, il nous paraît important que les investisseurs regardent la manière dont les projets et les investissements prennent en compte ces dimensions. Savoir si les entreprises ou les banques ont des stratégies, s'ils ont des outils, qu'ils mesurent et qu'ils rendent des comptes.
Notre rôle est de développer l'épargne de nos clients en finançant par exemple les entreprises qui apportent des solutions à la transition énergétique. C'est ce que nous faisons dans le cadre de notre politique charbon où nous n'investissons que dans les entreprises qui ont un plan de sortie du charbon en ligne avec les accords de Paris, tout en maîtrisant les conséquences sociales et sociétales de la fermeture des sites de production.
Une transition juste réussie comprend 4 dimensions.
Les 4 dimensions de la transition, la première évidemment, ça engage l'ensemble des sociétés, ça engage évidemment des territoires, puisque les effets de la transition peuvent être différents selon les territoires. Ça implique nous-mêmes les uns les autres en tant que consommateurs, et puis c'est enfin l'ensemble des travailleurs.
Toute la société doit s'engager ensemble pour la transition.
Il faut agir maintenant tout simplement parce qu'on est déjà profondément en retard, parce que s'il n'y a pas de transition juste, ce sera encore une fois les plus faibles, les plus fragiles qui seront durement impactés parce que de toute façon cette transition, elle aura lieu. On a le choix soit de la faire dans un cadre démocratique par le dialogue social, par la confrontation des intérêts et donc par la volonté de justice sociale, soit elle se fera brutalement.
La transformation qui nous attend est sans précédent et cela ne fonctionnera que si c'est juste et si cela fonctionne pour tous.
La place de Paris peut devenir le leader sur le sujet. C'est normal car il y a un territoire qui est très en avant, parce que c'est le lieu de l'accord de Paris. Montrer que la finance se met au service de la transition, va par là prévoir les transitions sociales plutôt que de les subir avec des conséquences qui pourraient être très dures.
La feuille de route de la place de Paris.
La première chose qu'on a voulu faire, c'était d'une certaine manière de définir la chose. Et maintenant, c'est de rentrer dans des actions de nature beaucoup plus concrète. Donc de quoi on parle? Ça veut dire par exemple se donner des méthodologies qui vont nous permettre d'investir dans des sociétés selon des critères qui vont intégrer la dimension de transition environnementale et son acceptabilité sociale.
So that was the Yeah, so that was the teaser in a way. I think first you would have recognized in the video a number of the participants to this session. So you will have the capacity to check if they contradict by each other between the video and their intervention today. And I think we're going first to leave the floor to Fiona to introduce the subject, because PRIs have really been, I would say, a pioneer on the concept on fair transition has started among the unions in particular. That's why we were very happy to have the conversation and in the video with Laurent Berger, the General Secretary of CFDT in French. But clearly it's the PRI that I would say have started the practical work on the ground. So I would like to give the floor to Fiona for her to introduce the subject from her perspective and to explain what PRI has already done and is also expecting for the market participants to do. So Fiona, please, the floor is yours.
Oh, well, thank you. Bonjour. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to be here. First of all, I want to say with the second wave taking hold across Europe, I really do hope that wherever you are, that you're safe and that your families and your colleagues are all keeping safe and well. It's really terrific to have so many people here today for this, what is a really important conversation about the just transition. It's a topic that I personally care really deeply about, and I really believe that it is more relevant and timely in the context of the ongoing pandemic and the discussion on how to build back better. What we've learned so far in managing a just transition can help us in our thinking as we seek to transition to a post-COVID world, and has already been mentioned, COVID-19 has also brought more attention to the S in ESG, and we need to make sure that we seize on that opportunity, and that's certainly what we want to do at the PRI, because we are in a world where we need to see an acceleration in the transition to a zero carbon economy. So the concept of a just transition is a key pillar of the 2015 Paris Agreement. And today it's entrenched in international sustainable development and climate flora. It weds the concept of social inclusion with climate action to ensure that the shift to a resilient zero carbon economy is fair and that it puts people at its heart. In fact, a just transition really is a precondition of successful climate action. Without the buy-in of all stakeholders, including workers and communities, there will be resistance. And take, for example, the Yellow Jackets protest. France knows this issue firsthand. If we don't bring the community along with us, we will fail when it comes to the transition. We see what's happening today with the political divide in some countries. And this is what happens when communities feel left behind. And this is understandable. If workers feel that their jobs and livelihoods are going to disappear and their ability to provide for their families is compromised without a plan for their future, then they'll vote for the person who's telling them that they will bring back, for example, the coal industry. And we've seen this happen in the United States. It helped US President Donald Trump win the last election. A similar situation happened in Australia. It has happened in other countries in the world. So not adequately dealing with and planning for a just transition can have significant consequences that we should not underestimate, and it impacts us all. And while this is not a problem that the private sector or the investment community can solve on its own, we do have a role to play. In the investment community, we also often spend time talking about and being concerned about stranded assets. In this case, however, we usually are talking about physical assets, or we're talking about fossil fuels that need to stay in the ground. But assets are not just physical. People and communities are also assets, and they can be stranded, and they must be on our radar and part of the discussion and part of the planning in the transition. In other words, a just transition requires that the transformational change to zero carbon economies in response to the climate crisis is designed and carried out in a manner that ensures that no one is left behind. That transition plans include workers and include communities. The people who pay the ultimate price for the transition cannot be the workers and communities of the world that are in the fossil fuel sector. This will not work. We can't repeat what's happened in many countries, such as the UK, where I live, where they closed down their coal sector in the 1980s. Today, many of those communities have still not recovered, creating poverty and division. Social considerations cannot merely be an add-on to climate action, and this is particularly true in contexts where addressing pre-existing high levels of unemployment, inequality and poverty are already a priority. There are risks of replicating or intensifying poverty and inequality through processes of transformation, but there are also opportunities for more equitable societal outcomes. Now, the ILO describes the characteristics of a just transition as including sufficient planning, the integration in implementing all sustainable development policies, the need for a well-managed process, the inclusion of meaningful social dialogue at all levels to bring about fair burden sharing, and again, ensuring that no one's left behind. And achieving this critical agenda in time and in light of the added complexity brought about by the COVID-19 crisis requires a whole economy response, which of course includes the private sector. It needs to take action, but alongside government policy. And in their role as long-term stewards of capital, the case for investor action is very clear. So over the past couple of years, and since the publication of the Grantham Research Institute and Harvard Institute for Responsible Investment Guide for Investor Action, which was produced in collaboration with the PRI and with the ITUC, investor awareness and action to support the just transition has grown significantly. Now with more than 160 investors with 10 trillion in assets under management, we have seen that this many have signed the PRI International Statement to support the just transition. In economies that were in a precarious state before COVID, realising a just transition is obviously a huge challenge. There is very high political sensitivity to employment gains or losses, which is why we've also seen a need to ensure that as we look to build back better from COVID-19, that we create new employment, that we create the green jobs of the future, and importantly, that these are good and secure jobs with adequate social protections. Building back better needs to not just focus on a green recovery, it also must focus on an inclusive one. So the PRI is working with our signatories to identify the practical steps that investors can take and how they can best use their leverage to meaningfully participate in the realisation of the Just Transition agenda. So we launched the International Investor Working Group on the Just Transition in September 2019, and it's co-chaired by two leading voices on the issue, Letitia Tanque from Arantec and also Mario Tremblay from Bonds de Solitaire, FTQ, and the Secretariat sits within the PRI. So the group is comprised of 60 members, and basically its objectives are to enhance the level of expertise of its members, to raise awareness among the wider investment community, to provide a platform for good practice and peer-to-peer learning and learning from other regions, as well as to signal to other stakeholders, to investors, to business, to governments, that investors have an interest and that we have a commitment to this agenda. The social implications of the transition to a low carbon economy translate very differently in different geographies. Therefore, it's also crucial that the just transition plans and actions are really tailored accordingly. And this is why we warmly welcome the French task force on the just transition, launched by Finance for Tomorrow, and the roadmap that seeks to place the just transition as a cornerstone of Paris Financial Centre's actions. Place-based initiatives such as this one are really incredibly important. Engaging with relevant stakeholders to inform the actions of the financial sector in a given context allows us to determine the most adapted course of action and to include in the process the voices of workers in the local areas and all of the affected right holders. So we really welcome these concerted efforts to develop practical tools to really come to grips with what is a complex issue. The just transition won't happen easily. It won't happen unless we all come together, civil society, workers' representatives, governments, investors, companies. So we really welcome the leadership of the Paris Financial Centre, and we really look forward to working with you as the program develops. So thank you. I think now is the time for us to really accelerate this agenda, and I hope that we can work together to do just that. So thanks for your time today.
Fiona, it's us thanking you for being with us. It was great for you to set the stage, and again, thanks very much for the PRI for their leadership and your leadership since the very beginning on the question. I think you mentioned a number of things that are very important for the discussion we're going to have. In a way, if I was to be a little provocative, I would say that reconciling the environmental agenda and the social agenda in a way or another, this is the key political challenge on the 21st century and the decade to come, in a way, by a way or another. So at the end of the day, that will have an impact, or that will have consequences on the agenda of the market participants and financial players that we are all. So I think that's the basic element that we should all have in mind. And here, I think what is difficult on this question, and that's exactly what we will try to do immediately with our guests, is for this question to come from the macro perspective that is relatively easy to understand on what can be done on a micro perspective on the ground. That's where the difficulty is. I think Nick has started to do a lot of work there based on, I would say, on the territorial dimension of that, but that's the difficulty. So that's what we're going to enter into in the conversation that we're going to have immediately. And the good thing is that for the people that are participating to this panel, we have an investor, namely Adrienne with LBP AM. We have a union, so a stakeholder with Marco. We have Sabine, that is, how can I call you, a manufacturer of methodologies for investors to deploy money accordingly. And with the SHIEL, we have an institution financing locally the local authorities, and that is also an issuer. So that should give us, by one or another, a good vision of the different things that can be done. So sorry for the participants, I'm not going to follow, I would say perfectly, the indicative list of questions and order that has been given me, because I would like to first to make a link with what Fiona was saying, with the first maybe question for you, Marco, because I think you're probably the best position to give us, in a way, the big picture, because you did a lot of work at European level, is how do you consider that the transition to a low carbon economy and an environmental friendly economy will affect the workers differently in Europe? I think it's important, it's interesting to get your perspective there. In the video we've seen, I would say, a quote from Ursula von der Leyen. There is this new instrument, which is the Just Transition Fund. So first, from a union perspective, can you explain to us a little bit and enter into the details, what will be the consequences of a transition policy at European level on the different workers on the ground?
Okay, I will try to answer to your question, Jean-Jacques. Of course, feel free to stop me if I will be too long. As a trade unionist, we are this kind habit to speak for a long time. But anyway, answering to your question, the first thing I would say, the COVID-19 crisis, its economic consequence has completely changed the picture and the scenario in which we are operating, and in the context in which this question should find an answer. In the medium term, but in 2-3 years, I think the economic problems that the COVID crisis is creating will overlap completely with the need to transform our societies, our way we produce and we consume. Just keep in mind that we have just asked our members in different European countries, just to know, for those that do not know the ETUC, the European Trade Union Confederation covers all the European countries. We have members in all the European countries and the accession countries to the EU. So we have, thanks to our members, we have a privileged view on the situation of the labor market in all over Europe. And we have realized that there are 39 million workers that will be directly hit if the emergency measures will be stopped suddenly at the end of the year. Of these 39 workers, what is more concerning that 14 million of them will be surely be fired if the measures will finish. It will be 14 million that belong to all sectors, and many of these sectors were already assumed to go through a strong transition phase because of the green agenda. So we cannot let's say disconnect the challenge we have with transforming our economy with the situation in which we are today. So we have all tools that we have to implement. There are all the workers whose skills can become obsolete, or the sectors that tend to disappear for the benefit of new emerging sectors. But the crisis, I would say, according to most of the experts, have accelerated processes. It is extremely urgent to intervene. And even if a few months ago, we were really looking at the micro level, so managing each situation one by one to activate collective bargaining, for instance, to manage the complexity, or entering in dialogue with local communities. Now the micro solution is the more and more intertwined with the micro pictures, active labor market policies, investing in skills, infrastructures for education, and health and safety that it be completely reshaped, organizational work, telework, etc. So it's, I mean, we are in a phase of remapping the social risks, and we are trying to redesign our strategy. Don't underestimate the fact that when the EU decided to make a huge investment plan for Europe, I mean, for the famous recovery plan, it's completely built on green and digital transformation. So even in the post-COVID or COVID and post-COVID economies, we are really strategically thinking that the green and digital challenges are there, and we have to address them. And there is a momentum now to do it. And at company level, I think we have to create public policies that are supporting change and this transformation, creating a new system of social protection, but also creating new rules for organizational work and health and safety. At the same time, I think in the companies is really time to restart collective bargaining, to refer as fundamental for just transition. Collective bargaining to solve the problems that are more conflictual, that puts business investors, workers, sometimes also local community in opposing interests that they must be mediated, but not to underestimate the big role that employee participation can have. The capacity to involve workers in the activities, and in order to manage the complexity, even because when you go company by company, we know very well there is not one solution fitting all. You really have to build packages. And what we want to be sure today of that is that the political, the public policy is really a framework for just transition. We are creating also a trade union narrative of this, using the SDG framework that in our view is the international language we have, is something big we did for humanity, but now we have to use this common language. So we are trying to build a narrative that is centered on SDG 8. Why? Because we need growth that is sustainable, we need jobs, and the capacity to win the consensus of workers with decent work agenda, and to exploit as much as possible the social dialogue. Our final objective should be to decouple, as the goal 8 says, growth from destruction of natural resources. That is why for us, goal 8 is sort of engine, and we want to exploit all the connection between goal 8, the positive correlation they have with the inequalities, with education skills, with poverty, and many others, there is only one relation that we have to invert, the correlation, which is with the green. Now, job growth, job maintenance, and better work quality conditions, we have demonstrated with our indicators that this is not yet in positive correlation with the green dynamics. And I think here private investors and public investments that we are doing should be the game changer. If we are able to do that with digital means, improving productivity, making a better use of technologies, if we invert this, I'm sure that we have done really a lot. So once again, all workers are concerned, certain areas more than others, all sectors are involved. We have to be able to detect the new risks where the problems are and to try to intervene. But in this moment, we really need to have an effort to remap, to have a new mapping of these risks. If you want, I can also come back on this because we have an idea of where these risks are today in our society from several indicators that tell us.
But maybe we'll come back to that in a minute, Marco. Thank you very much. I think it's interesting what you are saying at the end. It's by definition, you can consider that financing the transition is a way to offer new jobs, etc. So you are already participating to the social equilibrium, but it's not the end of the story. You need to do additional things also to really integrate the social dimension, which I think is a very that's the difficult thing to do. And by the way, but that's just a personal remark. I think based on what you are saying, there is around this question of fair transition, there is at the end of the day, also the question of the repartition, the share of added value between capital and labor at some point in time, which we should have somewhere in the back of our head. But I would like then that we transit a little to something that is more on the ground, because you touched base, Marco, the fact that the SDGs might offer first grammar trying to address the fair transition for investors. But maybe it's not the only thing that can be done. Maybe it's not that easy to practice. So then maybe Sabine, I think as I introduced you as a manufacturer of solutions for investors to address these kind of questions. First, do you think to address properly the just transition question by investors, do you think we need new tools? Do you think there are methodologies that are lacking first? And then second, can you explain a little bit what could be the type of methodologies that you are developing on your side to allow an investor like Adrienne, for instance, to really encompass the fair transition agenda in her investment policy?
Yeah, thank you, Jean-Jacques. Perhaps more than tools, I just want to answer the question because I think it's a hidden one. Why do investors should care about it? And according to me, they have two main reasons to care about just transition. First of all, because of it's their responsibility. And Fiona was mentioning it. 2020 has been the year for more holistic thinking in the ESG investment world. Across capital markets, we have become more attentive to the interconnection between finance and ESG, particularly on S factors. We are also now understanding and seeing at an accelerated pace what the negative effects are when ESG risks materialize. And in the coming decade, we will face some serious headwinds in many developed economies: unemployment, social unrest, the materialization of climate risk, amongst other reasons. And then the world of finance has a key role to play in navigating through and redressing some of these challenges. Governments alone, they cannot resolve these challenges. Corporates alone, they cannot resolve these challenges. And civil society alone, they cannot resolve neither these challenges. And we'll all need to join our efforts here. And also we need to remember that for ages, for centuries, investors always have played a fundamental role in shaping the world in which we live, and responsibility is about facing down these responsibilities. And because just transition is really a holistic framework, and that's a good thing, I think first we need to recognize that a lot of action in the climate field has been myopic or one-dimensional and tackling on limit. You also mentioned that we need to develop and to see the interconnection between the E and the S, and the risk creating new risk whilst addressing others. And the Just Transition concept allows investors to mobilize around the E and S objectives, to work, Marco mentioned that, on multiple SDGs at the same time, and it allows for more comprehensive thinking, which is much more supportive to impactful and balanced outcomes. So when you are tackling the question of the lack of methodology, because it's also a question which is pretty regularly raised, I just to say that at Vigeo Eiris, we took a very pragmatic and step-by-step approach. So we started to work by understanding who the stakeholders in play were and what were the main risks they faced. Effectively, there are three in play: communities, risk becoming stranded communities; workers, risk becoming the stranded workers; and the planet, risks related to climate change. We then look to understand what are the fundamental ESG criteria that they need respected by corporates in order to lay the conditions for a just transition. And we identified 7: career management, responsible reorganization, the respect of fundamental labor rights and social dialogue, community development, human rights in their operation, and the supply chain. And across, we look to understand whether companies have put in place the fundamental commitments and means that would allow for a just transition to be executed. And we also track any controversies they face, okay? So our methodology is therefore not designed to be an on-the-ground audit. We rather provide measurements on how well a company is positioned to support a just transition, a fair transition, and is it doing the fundamentals for the key stakeholders that will be impacted. By building that lens, actually we have been able to identify large differences in ESG practices between similarly sized companies from the same activities, and some appear as much better positioned than others to retain, to reorganize in a transparent manner, and to uphold commitments to communities. So just to end on the particular challenging in developing this methodology and how we can find the right data. For sure, product development in ESG is always something and somewhat challenging, as our industry is still relatively new, still growing and maturing. In this case, our main challenges revolved around data. You mentioned that, so access to information. In a nutshell, a part of our Just Transition analysis frameworks looks to understand the commitments, I mentioned that, the measures and the processes that companies are putting in place to manage reorganization. V has actually researched this topic since 2002. Just transition is a topic that is essential to understanding social risk, but that companies are notorious, reluctant to disclose information on. And this is why we are participating to that webinar to display more information around the just transition. Remember, in the midst of 2008 financial crash, when we were seeing companies across sectors downsize their employees' accounts, we saw remarkably little information on how this dimension of social risk was to be managed. We can understand it. That has always been a stigma around this kind of information, with external stakeholders considering this as an area of weaknesses. There is also a limited amount of guidance on what and how companies should disclose. And there is not really such thing as the right data. So what we're looking for are some very basic qualitative elements: commitments to consult and or negotiate with employees or on reorganization, measures to support employees, retraining, mobility, support networks, more transparent information on how many employees have been impacted by this, and potentially how the impact on the communities and the countryside, as on the climate, is taken into consideration and managed to remediate and to revitalize. In a nutshell, the challenge is almost that the majority of companies across all sectors are still struggling to find a way to disclose relevant and important information on this dimension of social risk. And both by assessment, as an assessment agency and as investors, our mission is to create an environment that is more supportive to all of these different types of company that need to transition to more sustainable models, especially because of the existing pandemic. You were mentioning that as an introduction. So it needs to be understood as a sign of strength, adaptation, and commitment to sustainability, and not as a weakness.
Thanks, Sabine. Well, first, thank you very much, because I think now we are entering deep into the substance, because you mentioned very, I would say, precise criteria. So maybe a question that would be, I don't know if that is as straightforward as I would present it, but it means that if tomorrow I am an investor and that I want to design an investment framework where I'm going to integrate the just transition dimension into my portfolio, I can ask you to provide me, I would say, data based on the 7 criteria you mentioned, and therefore to filter my investment universe based on that, and to decide to allocate capital according to that grid in a way. Is it fair to present it that way?
Yeah, it is.
Okay, great. So I'm not making publicity to Vigeo Eiris, but it means for the investors that are around that at least they have a way to test what this type of grid or approach may be. And so it means that practically speaking, and to come back to Fiona's point at the beginning, which what can we do actually in practice, we can use this type of approaches, at least trying to approach the companies into which we invest in. So it's a good question for you, Adrienne, in a way. So I'm not going to ask you, are you going to use the Vigeo Eiris, I would say, grid immediately? But maybe just a step back. I think it's been a while that LBP Asset Management has started to introduce green bonds, social bonds, so a number, I would say, of instruments. And the question we may have is that we see that there are the components of a potential general strategy, but can you tell us, having all these components, is it enough to design, I would say, a fair transition investment policy?
Yes, no, it's, as you said, definitely we use ESG, green and social bond into our investment portfolio. It's definitely not enough, you know, to really work on the just transition, but it's already a good starting point. Maybe I would like, you know, to subscribe to what Sabine and Fiona just said earlier in terms of the definition of the role of an investor. And we at La Banque Postale Asset Management, we are definitely a socially responsible asset manager. So our role is to develop our client savings by integrating on a significant and engaging way environmental and social criteria into our investment decisions. So definitely the just transition is really a fundamental concept for us, and it's really at the forefront of our investment philosophy. So maybe if I go really practical, as you said, Jean-Jacques, and I think it's one of the goals of this webinar is to give maybe example of you know, how we can invest following the just transition principle. So one of our examples that we have is our policy on coal investment. We have not decided to invest in companies following some thresholds in terms of, you know, production, in terms of an amount of their revenues made by coal. But we have a different approach, and we have decided to only invest in companies that have announced a strategy and a plan to exit coal production at a speed aligned with the principle of the Paris Agreement, but while monitoring the social impacts of closing production sites, exactly as Fiona said in her introduction. So for example, and coming back to also some of the criteria that Sabine mentioned, we make sure that their salaries are offered retraining programs, you know, once the production sites again are closed and that they need to change their jobs. But so we would definitely like, you know, to mainstream this investment philosophy and you know, have it on all our different strategy and asset classes. But as you said, and as what is expressed also in the position paper that Finance for Tomorrow published, we really lack comparable data and methodology. So I'm not going to come back on what Sabine just said, because we obviously fully subscribe to what she said. But maybe as now, you know, the regulation is is going to, for example, there is like a new discussion on the non-financial reporting directive. So maybe it's an opportunity to ask all the issuers to publish a common set of social indicators so that we can have comparable data. And maybe those indicators can be published using a standard framework like the TCFD, but that could be adapted to social indicators. So this would be a big step for us investors that would really help us work on the just transition, even if we have lots of help coming from a rating agency like Sabine just explained.
Thanks, Adrienne. As an investor, I can only concur on that. I would love to see the word social pronounced in the taxonomy or within the context of the non-financial disclosure directive. Maybe just because I think it's important again to get practical, to come back to your coal example, which I think is a very interesting one. It means, for instance, very practically speaking, if I am a utility that I announce that I'm closing my coal power plants in somewhere in the world and that I fire all the people working there, it means you don't invest into it because of that, despite the fact that the company would be totally aligned with a coal exit strategy that is aligned with science-based.
Yes, absolutely. And probably this particular case that you mentioned would be a good example for us for engaging discussion. Maybe just before we absolutely close our positions on this company, we would engage discussion with them to explain them how important it is that they also take into account the social consequences of their strategy. And so there would be a first a step towards engagement, but then if the company doesn't answer with concrete actions on the social aspects, we would cut our positions.
Okay, but that's clear. That gives also a practical example of things that can be done. Maybe continuing the conversation on the existing instruments or things that can be done, even if Adrienne has started and Sabine to touch base a little bit on things we need to do more. But before asking for more for things to do more, maybe we can see what we can do with what we have. Is it possible for maybe Vincent, Phil? I briefly introduced what FIL is for the non-French participants. So you're a very large green and social issuer. Basically, do you think that is enough? You're issuing green bonds and social bonds. Do you think it's enough to achieve a fair transition agenda in connection with one of the most important stakeholders in that debate that you know very well, which are the local authorities?
Thank you, Jean-Jacques, for your question. Since FIL is not very well known, let me start with a few words about our company, just to complete what you just said. FIL is a young public development bank created in 2013 in response to the last financial crisis. FIL has two public missions, indeed. First of all, lending loans to the French local public sector in partnership with our friends, La Banque Postale. We are the leader on this market with 30 billion euros new loans since 2013. And our second public mission is lending liquidity to finance French large export contracts. To carry out our missions, we have issued 45 billion euros during the last 7 years. Among them, 3 billion euros consist of green bonds to finance municipality sustainable investments and of social bonds to finance French public hospitals investments. Obviously, I think green and social bonds are useful to channel capital towards a just transition. I will give you some indicators to illustrate the investors' appetite for our sustainable bonds. On average, we have 113 investors for our ESG bonds against 61 for our ordinary issues. The overall coverage ratio reached 3.7 for our sustainable bonds against 1.6 for ordinary issues. What does that mean? That means if we ask for 1 billion euros, investors present 3.7 billion for our green bond or social bond and 1.6 billion euros for an ordinary issuance. So these figures show that there is a great appetite for sustainable bonds. So to my opinion, the problem is not about a lack of capital or of financial instruments, but I think we can make progress on two aspects in order to improve the existing instruments. And I'm not saying that sustainability-linked bonds or transition bonds are not useful. But concerning SFIN, the first one is data gathering. And the second one is how we can help municipalities present more projects that are labeled as sustainable. Regarding data gathering, we don't have any problem with our social bonds since they are dedicated for the French public hospitals, and we use national data such as number of stays, number of beds, other indicators. But we do have difficulties if we are talking about the French local public sector, since there is not indicator at the national level of the climate impact of municipalities' investment. So we have to analyze each project and collect local data. And it's very important, we are talking about local data. And don't forget that we are talking about the French local public sector with 35,000 municipalities and 100 departments. Some are very small, and we need to set up a close dialogue, and it's very time consuming. And asking for data means more work for municipalities. And to this day, unfortunately, there is no spread between green loans or ordinary loans, between green bonds or ordinary issuances in terms of pricing. So municipalities are not rewarded for this work. It doesn't help. We hope it will be the case in the medium term. Regarding the second aspect, I think there is no problem of funding or liquidity, but a lack of green projects from municipalities themselves. Indeed, among their projects, only a few comply with our requirements. We can hope that the French recovery plan and EU plan will increase the share of these sustainable investments. It's a question of how municipalities integrate green indicators when they are building their project from the start. So they have to assimilate a lot of new concepts. And I think to conclude my comments, it's an important paradigm shift for the local public sector.
Thanks, Vincent. I think you're in your intervention, you're raising a point that is very important, but very common in a way for market participants. It's a little the chicken and egg problem, is that to attract investors, you need projects, and to have projects, you need to see that there is some investors' appetite, because the two things are working together. But one of the messages you convey that is very important is that we are seeing progressively on the social bond side something that we've seen on the green bond side, which is basically that as an issuer, if you issue a green bond and a social bond at the moment, first you'll lower down your cost of capital, and second, you are diversifying massively your investors base. So from a pure financial perspective, there is a very strong incentive for issuers, to do that. But it's interesting because we have started to look a little bit at the criteria we use to address the Just Transition agenda. Sabine has presented some. Adrienne has explained what she's doing on call using this type of criteria, for instance, to make that happening. I would like to come back to you, Marco, on that front, because from your perspective and from your window, you have a very nice window, by the way. I don't know what we see behind, but it seems pretty nice. What would be, in your view, what should be the criteria that Adrienne should use to deploy capital according to the fair transition? You've started to touch base that a little, mentioning all the elements that companies need to encompass to address the transition and accompanying the workers in the company. But from your perspective, what should be the criteria we should use?
Okay, thank you for this question. We are quite advanced in creating indicators to evaluate the public policies, but I think that certain elements can be also used to orientate the private sector's choices. To be quite sincere, if I have to go as an investor, first of all, I like the idea that there should be a sort of a shareholder activism. So when the shareholder engage with the companies to try to improve their situation, having clear objectives. And first of all, the first thing I will look at if there is a good dialogue between the workers and the management. And a dialogue that is capable to address the complexity of the transformation of the company. And I already mentioned the two instruments that I consider crucial: collective bargaining and participation. Consider that time to time these two elements work together. For instance, when they establish profit sharing schemes, performance related payments, when they start addressing the pays of top managers and the bottom of the page scale. So this can really work very, very effectively. But then there are also other elements that for just transition could be very, very relevant. For instance, how much, taking in mind the total wage bill of the company, how much is spent for skills and reskilling of people compared to this total wage bill. For instance, this can be a very important indicator also for what Adrienne was saying. If all companies would be asked to report on this, we will add an element of consensus and of strategy that will be extremely important. Another things that I would like to measure is the collective bargaining coverage. So to be sure that all the operations of the companies, especially the bigger one and the transnational one, have a wide coverage of collective bargaining. Pay transparency is crucial to identify the risks, as it was said by one of the speakers before me. I think Sabine was referring to that. Pay transparency and reporting pay transparency in pay gaps are very important, especially on the gender dimension. The women can be the big losers of this process, and they deserve a specific attention. And diversity policies. Diversity today is very important. Just keep in mind how the people would like to see the business community engaged in favor of diversity, and not only men and women. I have in mind what is happening in the US until a few time ago on the Black Lives Matter. I think this is a good drive. Finally, two other things that I consider very, very crucial. One is work-life balance and occupational welfare. They are often together. These elements are also coming from HR management policies or from collective bargaining. So these are clearly elements that can be measured. Existence of occupational welfare, how much it values, and how much it helps work-life balance. And very finally, health and safety. Health and safety, we have to make a huge effort because the climate change and the transformation of the way we introduce new elements of danger and risks for people. Now here, the issue is not only to stick with the laws. I think here the issue is to look for the best technology to protect health and life of workers. And this is something additional that the business community should do, because in this this was one of the main results of our investigation for adaptation to change. Health and safety, so the way we protect health of people, it changed all the time. And just take also the COVID-19 impact in the concept of transformation. We didn't consider mental health as a predominant problem in the health and safety policies. And today we have to put inside this element because the reasons of stress for workers are becoming so huge that often also is becoming a problem not only for the society but also for the single businesses. I would stop here my wishful list, but just to tell you that we are this policy areas, or we have been transformed in indicators that we have selected. They belong to our instruments to monitor the impact of public policies. But these indicators in particular, the 7, 8 I mentioned, for me can be part of the tick list or of the criteria list that investors can have in their hands to understand if they are investing their money in a way that can have a good return in the mid-long term and produce also some social impacts.
No, thanks, Marco. I think it's really precise. I don't know how many participants we still have, so I hope we've not lost too many, because I think here we're entering into, I would say, a moment where we can really see that there are some very practical way to assess companies, and something that, an argument that I hate in my own industry, and people are saying, oh, we can't do that because we don't have the data. Honestly speaking, on most of the points you mentioned, there is the data. Huh? Personally, I created a fund that is focused on social inequalities, and basically when you try to assess, do I have the data to see if there is participation within the company, so basically if the added value is shared with the people that are working in the company, what is the wage policy, etc., etc. Okay, it's a little extra work to find the data, but at the end of the day you can find it. So I think here with your wish list, it's not only a wish list on a number of things, the data exists. I see Sabine nodding, so what I'm saying must be partially true at least. So I think here we have very practical elements that we can use in management of portfolios to integrate that dimension. Then I would come back to you, Adrienne, because I think we've discussed here some of the elements, potential instruments, way to integrate the question into portfolios. There are different ways to approach the Just Transition agenda. I think it was one in the conclusive papers of Nick Robbins last year. There are different ways to attack the problem. So you have the engagement with companies also. So basically, can you assess the pros and cons of the different approaches? Do you have your own recommendations to your little friends and colleagues from the investment world that are participating, say that's what we believe is efficient? So can you tell us what you think on the different forms of, I would say, commitments or tools that we can use?
Sure. I think we mainly focus at LBPM on two tools, and first is really investment strategy, and the second one is engagement, as I already started a little bit to touch base on. But maybe coming back to investment strategy. So the role of a conviction asset manager is above all to pick the issuers that have long-term growth prospects, that have strategy that are in line with our own anticipations as investors. So if we doesn't agree with the way a company addresses, for example, the Just Transition, we simply do not invest in it. So that's really our first tool, is really not to invest in company that do not provide the data that Marco mentioned, and that's really our role again as a conviction asset manager and as a stock picker. And then the second tool that might be interesting is engagement. So engagement is again, our first rule is really, not to invest, but engagement can be a useful tool, especially to accompany transition, especially, when a full sector is concerned by the transition, as, for example, again, is the coal sector. So in our coal policy, when a company has committed to eliminate coal from all its activities, but for example, that the social aspects are not addressed, or that the horizon is not aligned with the Paris Agreement, then we engage in a discussion in order to make them understand how important it is that they align their strategy with the scientific horizons that have been put in place, or with the social aspects. So investment strategy, engagement are a good tool, but maybe also I would like to stress another tool, that is transparency. And transparency is actually a very useful tool for any socially responsible investor, but especially on the Just Transition, when we can really provide proof of what we are try to invest and try to achieve. So this is obviously easier on for example, on real assets rather than on public assets. But for example, for our private assets portfolio invested in private debt or infrastructure debt, we have worked with a consultant, with Ernst & Young, on a social report that allows us to measure the number of jobs created and the contribution to GDP generated, for example, by our energy transition investments. So also reporting and transparency is a good tool for, to help practices on the just transition.
Thanks, and I think something you said, Adrienne, which is important. I personally believe that engagement only works when it is linked with investment policy. It's when you engage with a company explaining that if the company doesn't evolve, then you will act as an investor and you would therefore basically reduce your position vis-a-vis the company. That's the way the incentive is working. Otherwise, engagement, I would say India, I think that doesn't properly work, and that's what you're doing on call in particular. Maybe Sabine, coming back to you, I have a question, which is, at the moment, do you see investors coming to you more and more to ask you, I would say, elements about, for instance, the methodology you mentioned, or how to better integrate the Just Transition agenda? Do you see, I would say, a rising demand? And do you see, I would say, specific areas of focus on which, because you're a provider, so you're a provider. So basically, what are people like us are asking you on that front at the moment? Because I think now you have a nice wish list of Marco that you will have to translate into some of your ratings. So I'm more than happy to buy them afterwards, by the way. I would be interested to understand a little bit what is the demand you see from investors for this kind of data or criteria.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, actually, we are having a rising demand. We are serving with a tool, namely Data Lab. We made evolved because of also the freshness of the demand and the maturity, which is a growing one the past, I won't say 12, 18 months. Actually, we have a lot of demand because of EU taxonomy and TCFD you were mentioning, are also tools they're starting to use to go on that just transition. Also because you did not remember that, or perhaps I was not listening properly, but Europe launched that just transition fund early in 2020 from 100 billion to 150 to support the just transition. And we all know also that there is something like almost 200 asset managers worldwide who did gather the means in order to provide really some offer on the market based on the just transition. So through the Data Lab and our assessment, so we are providing an assessment on a 100 notation. We have that ability to provide to asset managers, access to data so that they can drive their strategy, their portfolio strategy, and also experiment a certain number of elements. First of all, back to Adrienne, she was mentioning that the measurements through criteria and through the transparency of the reporting, because we have already this information on kind of pretty important number of sectors. We are assessing through criteria the impact because of the legacy of the information we are gathering for years now, and because our methodology somewhere on that side did not change. So we are capturing something, we can make some measurement, and we can compare regarding data, especially also because of the 2008 crisis and the way it has been done, and then we can make comparison. And actually it's a pretty interesting period of time somewhere because of the pandemic, and we put in place a specific also assessment since the start of the year in order to really steer the learning from that approach to market and to just transition, And we're going to release end of this year some, information and key learnings. I think it would be great also to share more broadly spoken to the market participants. Lastly, we've got some demand also on the side of the issuers, because they are more and more, especially at the board of directors level, at the supervisory board level, they are really encompassing that first they need to be educated in order to understand what does it mean, ESG, what does it mean, that just transition. We had 3 demands from issuers, so it's not a big number, but it's really the past months it came to us. In order to first be educated and understand how it works, and also how to approach and understand, investors' requirements. And I also appreciate very much what Adrienne was saying, that you are not saying no by essence or by principle, but just open, engage the issuer to discuss about the project. And I guess on some topics, it allows them to shift and adapt their strategy, and potentially to open themselves to a different way to approach, especially the cross-fertilization, if I can say, of the factors depending on the S and the factors depending on the E. Something we did not mention, and I will end on that, it's everything related to the G and the governance. I think we can't have a proper just transition if we don't have a proper look to the governance, which is important because it goes through audit committees and through a certain number of elements which are part of the assessment of the G, actually. And it's and I will end on that point. It's very important that first of all we continue to work together, providing either best practices, guidance, use case, actually, in order to help the market to grow and to mature, because still we are pretty fresh on that topic. And also, second, we are sharing more openly some of the results, because we have already some results. You were mentioning, I think, Vincent, some sustainability linked loans, and we have some experience, with the SLL, and even start with the SLB or social bond, where we can encompass some results because it was a support to just transition. So I think there is a bit of work to be done there, and my understanding is also with Finance for Tomorrow that you are keen, as with the PRI, to share this experience and how it has been not only done but also the results and somewhere the value which has been positively impacted even at the stock exchange level.
No, thanks, Sabine. I think so. That's exactly what we try to do today. Yes, Fiona, I saw you demuted yourself, so please.
Yeah, I just wanted to add very quickly to all of the wonderful comments that have been made. I think that within the investment community, I talked about the fact that we had 160 people who'd signed the statement that we had. We've got 60 people in our working group. If I think about issues around broader social issues, human rights, etc., labour rights issues, we've also had groups working on these issues. But again, we're talking about hundreds. We have 3,000 signatories. This is not enough out of the signatory base, out of investors who are stepping up on these issues. So what over the past, since the PRI was formed, we've worked on social issues, but often in a siloed way. So thinking about, it might be labour rights in the extractive sector, for example. So it's a particular issue in a particular sector. One of the things that we've just launched to try to bring all of these issues together is a 5-year human rights program. And of course, human rights includes labour rights and includes freedom of association. It includes all of these issues, work that's underpinned by the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And that will, that 5-year program is really designed so that by the end of the 5 years, that we have every one of our signatories thinking about human rights and how they how they incorporate them within their investment process. And to try to ensure that they do that and that we can get good information, we will start to add to our reporting framework mandatory reporting eventually. It'll start off voluntary, but mandatory reporting eventually around human rights and these issues. So I really want to see that within 5 years' time, like with climate change, that all investors, they might be doing things slightly differently, they might be at different stages of the journey, but they're all doing something and they're all reporting on it. But it does need a concerted effort. I think that, you know, investors have leverage and they need to use that leverage. They can do that in things we've talked about, engagement. Start by asking the questions and asking for the information. That is not difficult. They can do it in how they invest and what they decide not to invest in. It's also really important on engaging with policymakers, which is another form of leverage that we have as well, to say to policymakers, this is what we want, this is the information that we need, we want to work with you on these issues. And then, of course, coming back to the transparency issue, the disclosure issue, making sure that we can collect this data. We need to be asking forward and getting it in the disclosures. I think that we've started to, you know, PRI is part of Climate Action 100+, as many investors are. And through TPI, in the benchmarking that we're doing about companies, the just transition issues are starting to be included as well. Hopefully that can help with some of the disclosures in the work that we're doing. But I just do really want to say to investors that, you know, there's this fantastic core group doing fantastic work, and they're passionate about what they're doing. But we need more people if we're going to make a big difference, to join with us to really take this issue forward. And we need to go further, faster, because this isn't the only transition we're going to have. We've got the just transition from the climate issue. We're going to have this whole issue around COVID, but we're also having a big digital transformation, and the world of work is changing, and it's going to change even further. So, you know, this isn't an isolated incident, and so we have to get this right.
Thanks, Fiona. And to paraphrase a very famous American activist, in a way, we're here all to recruit you. So all the participants, we need to recruit you the maximum. I see there are some questions that are popping around. I hope everyone can see them. I will pick up one and giving the floor to Marco on one in particular afterwards. Before that, and I also see Nick taking pages of notes, and as he's already one of the most knowledgeable person about the subject, I want to leave him some time to conclude from everything he heard. But maybe, Vincent, I would like to have a final question on your side, because we touched base a little on the local community dimension, but it's a very crucial element in the subject. And so basically and you raised the fact that you need more projects. So can you tell us, how do you practically work with policymakers to have the projects that you want to finance according to your fair transition or just transition agenda?
Yes, so we engage in a close dialogue with local policymakers so that they can better integrate European taxonomy and our reporting requirements. So it's quite easy for the biggest cities, since they have a trained staff, but we work closely with smaller municipalities so that they assimilate this concept. More precisely, we have a team dedicated to this dialogue, and they have to test every project to identify sustainable investments. So I think that the French local public sector needs time to integrate these challenges. It's an ongoing process. And once again, I'm not talking about the big cities. They have expertise to deal with these challenges. So I think it will be better in the medium term, but if we want to achieve the transition, we need definitely more green projects, and we need more municipalities involved in the transition.
Thank you. Maybe before leaving the floor to Nick, there is a very good question by Linda Zelina. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing properly. It's a very long question, so I cannot read it fully, but it's about the risk of S-washing and behind that there is the question how we should gather, I would say, data and on social questions and disclosed by investors, and in a way that links directly to a topic that is very close to Marco's heart, which is the idea of a social taxonomy. So maybe to prevent the S-washing, Marco, do you think we need a social taxonomy? And it may open, I would say, the minds to everyone. We are in the middle of the green taxonomy. Do you think we need a social one?
Exactly what I want to say, because it's very the topic of the moment in the discussion also at European level. I understand that from the investor's point of view is important also sometimes to simplify what is complex in order to be more effective, also to be protected against the reputational risks, and so I understand that this idea of taxonomy is attractive, even because it worked with the green taxonomy. But frankly speaking, on green, I see that there was a need to create consensus around the word green to create a full-fledged concept. When it comes to the word social, I don't think it's not a problem of consensus. I'm afraid, but here I think is something for discussion. I'm afraid that there is an issue of acceptance. So to accept the idea that the social is very well defined, especially when it relates to workers into consumers, especially in Europe, in the greatest part of the Western world, these two concepts are well defined in public policies, in the legislation, and for largest part also into the statistical and evidence collection. So it's there, the concept is there. I try to identify some of these elements of this concept of social when it's related to work and to consumers. I'm afraid that the social taxonomy can become a sort of shortcut and to limit the idea of social to few international standards that can be meaningful in part of the developing world, but can be less meaningful for Europe and many other parts of the world. In this case, we will not really attain the objectives that we are discussing today. So to make a business that are sustainable, that can pay back to their investors, and at the same time to ensure the fair transition that could be green or digital, but we need to go there. So once again, I think that social is very well defined. The only thing is to accept that these rules, these policy frameworks exist, and to build on this a methodology that takes into account. The first remedy, I want to say again, I already said 2 times, but I want to say again that one of the important things to avoid social washing is to engage with worker representatives that can be unions, works councils, it depends on the country, but this level of engagement is also very well structured. I don't want to say that it works always. Sometimes it's necessary to train and retrain the workers' representatives to address this role that could be somehow new. We were used to speak with the HR manager, but probably if you want to enter into this game, we should be able also to speak with other levels of management, also to speak with the shareholders, or maybe to take the floor in the shareholder assembly. I don't know, things like this. I mean, we also have to take our responsibilities, improve our capacity to have a new forms of dialogue because of the transformations and the just transition. But still, on the social side, this is the people you have to talk to as investors and as business to avoid the social washing. For the green, it was a bit more complicated because also there we need to find new interlocutors and new dialogue. But for the social, I think, especially for those that operate in Europe, is very well established, and we should stick with this. This is what I wanted to say, because for us is something that we are discussing exactly in these days with the European Commission and the stakeholder groups.
At European level, I would agree. And then if you have a conversation on social with a US-based investor, I think that the story would be a little different. And maybe it would be even easier at European level without the UK in. Sorry, it's just to annoy Nick a little that I'm saying that. I was just maybe, I think, Nick, it would be great for you to give us your perspective, because again, I think you've been one of the very limited number of persons that have started to work on this concept initially, that have started to propose things to do to investors. So maybe it's the good time for you to tell us also how you see the evolution of the concept that you've helped to forge, in a way, is spreading around among the investors community. What do you expect? Also, what do you see from this conversation of things that can be done by each of us? So Nick, I leave you the floor for this conclusive remarks.
Well, thank you, Jean-Jacques, and thanks Fiona and Marco and Adrienne and Vincent and Sabine for your words. It's really good to see this. And one thing I've gathered is the main challenge we face is time, and time is a non-renewable resource, and we're finishing very soon. So I hope not to speak very quickly, but I'll try and get my comments across. The main thing, I think, is that the Just Transition is a team sport. And so I have 11 themes, which I think capture some of the themes, all beginning with the word P, letter P. So first is obviously P as in people. And I think one of the things maybe to come across is actually that the transition is a huge opportunity, as well as the risks that we've heard about. Particularly, we know that the green economy has more jobs than the high carbon economy. We need to make sure that these are good jobs. The other thing I think we've heard today is that the Just Transition is an accelerant. We're talking about the race to net zero. A Just Transition will help us run fast by running together. So that's the first P, people. Secondly, for investors, we heard why investors. Sabine, you talked about that, I think, very smartly. But it's a question of principle. It's a question of, it's the right thing to do. It was very interesting hearing in the film at the beginning that 10%, the richest 10%, create 52% of greenhouse gas emissions. That does not include the investment portfolios of the richest 10%. Third piece is the political economy, the necessity for this, which we've heard about. And I think, again, for investors, we can cast that in terms of systemic risk. If we do not have a Just Transition, then the systemic risks that portfolios will face, the savers will face, will be that much greater. So 3, political economy. Then what can investors do? And we've heard a lot about this. The performance aspect, the methodologies, the metrics, and so on. The LSE, as you know, is the academic partner for TPI. We're working with Candriam on this whole question of metrics. It's very clear at the moment that the current frameworks does not have the Just Transition, the non-financial reporting directive, TCFD, but there's some opportunity there. Number 5, in terms of P, is pressure. So engagement. Really good, Adrienne, to hear about what you've been doing. I think the focus on utilities, it works. In my country, the UK, one of the utilities, SSE, is bringing forward a Just Transition plan as a result of investor dialogue. So it works. One area I would suggest potentially of great interest is engagement on Just Transition with commercial banks, because they have, again, potentially closer to the real economy. So that would be one area. 6P is product. We touched on this in terms of what are the asset classes where there is opportunity. Vincent, very interesting to hear about the municipal level, but also I think this is an area for sovereign bonds. In the UK has not issued a green sovereign bond yet, but there's a proposal for a green plus sovereign bond. So this would be allocation to assets, but the plus would be the social in terms of jobs, skills, and regions. And then Adrienne, you talked about the real assets and so on. Again, I think infrastructure, private debt, a real opportunity there. Then place, we talked about that, the territoire and so on. I think that is an area of particular focus because we know that Just Transition is not regionally neutral. Number 8, And two things here is questions of policy and public finance. How does the private financial community work with public finance, with the development banks, EIB, the EBRD, and crowd in private capital for the Just Transition mechanism? And then in terms of policy advocacy, what can investors do to make sure that policymakers have the key message? Two final Ps. Number 10, the center forward is going to be partnership, and particularly the capacity of investors to listen to other stakeholders, trade unions and communities. And then maybe the final one is planetary. Number 11 is the planetary dimension. The greatest challenge of the Just Transition is in the South. We're working in India with financial actors there, with public finance and private finance. And obviously there are issues around supply chains and the operations of, let's say, European multinationals in developing countries. That's my team, my 11 Ps for the Just Transition. Thanks very much. I've learned a lot. And maybe one thing, maybe handing over to Anne-Claire. As you know, I helped set up the Financial Centers for Sustainability Network, of which Finance for Tomorrow is a founding member. And I think the Just Transition would be a great theme for that network to take globally across 30 financial centers. Thank you very much.
And Claire, you can react to Nick's point immediately before we conclude. I would have one thing to add afterwards, but so Anne-Claire, do you take the hand that is offered by Nick?
Yes, for sure. That's why I also took the occasion to put my camera on when Nick mentioning it. So I don't know, Jean-Jacques, do you want me to do briefly the conclusion word, or do you want to add something before I react?
No, maybe on my side, and then I give you the floor, Anne-Claire. But on my side, I would add a 12P to Nick, which would be a pleasure. It was a great pleasure to have you all with us today. I think if I take one thing out of the conversation is that for the people that are online with us, I think we've given you some ideas of what you can do practically speaking. It means you can take the 7 criteria grid of Sabine and use it in your portfolio. You can take Marco's wish list and also try how to integrate that in the assessment you make of companies. You can take what Vincent is doing as an issuer to see, or maybe to invest into what he's issuing. That's a little publicity there. So I think here the ambition that we have is to give that practical elements on how to do things afterwards. And then Claire will tell us how we will continue the work at Finance for Tomorrow on that front in the future. And maybe on my side, a personal note for Amundi, we will try, if possible, by the, I would say, sanitary conditions that is delaying a little everything, to launch on our side the first open-ended Just Transition Fund at European level before the end of the year. So based on that, I leave you the floor, Anka.
Thank you, Jean-Jacques. Yes, and maybe I can just start by answering, yes, Nick, and for sure, we are very proud to have been at the initiative as well with Nick and many other of the creation of the FC Forest network. And for sure, even like for green finance, if climate and green finance was at the beginning, maybe at the heart of the discussion, we see also that broader sustainability issue and for sure social issue are also now on the table, and I think that it will be also very important to push also this issue and the topic of fair transition within the network as well to broaden the subject. So I won't be too long, and sorry I was not able to join you for the full panel, but I really appreciate the last word that and the promising discussions I've heard. So yes, we are living in a period of crisis, but also a period of transition, as it has been said all along the panel, and we are experiencing today that this transition can be brutal or not, and that finance has a major role in ensuring that the transition is rapid, sustainable, but also that it takes social requirements into account. So again, thank you very much, Jean-Jacques, for taking this leadership in Finance for Tomorrow on our Just Transition task force, and for for organizing this side event today. I think it's very important that we can also remind that social issue is essential if we want to make the transition. I also want to thank you. I think Fiona is not here anymore, but I wanted to thank Fiona and the PRI for hosting this webinar, and we sincerely hope that we will continue to collaborate on this subject. We have many issues of collaboration with the PRI, but specifically on this topic, I think it deserves to be brought together. So thank you to the PRI again, and thank you to the speakers, Sabine, Adrienne, Marco, and Vincent, who really, I think, represent the diversity that we have in Paris within our members, and which is the strength of the Paris Financial Center. And finally, big thank you to you, Nick. I'm so sorry that we are not able to see each other in Paris. The same thing with every other international friends, but I'm happy to see you on the screen today, and thank you as every time really for your work and your leading work in England on Just Transition. We try to go also a little bit more beyond you in Paris, but thank you again for your enlightening look at the issues on the Just Transition. And just a last word to say that the Paris Financial Center does not intend to stop here. On the contrary, we must go faster and further for sure on this crucial topic, and we will be very happy in the upcoming months to keep you update with Jean-Jacques of the next step of our work within Finance for Tomorrow, and our reflection of the Just Transition make us understand that the ecological transition will only exist through the social sphere. I think it's clear for everyone now, but it's really important. That was the theme of the Climate Finance Day last year, and it will be also at the heart of the Climate Finance Day tomorrow. Using sustainable finance to build the European real economy will be key in the upcoming months and years, and a green recovery will not be possible without making a fair transition. And I think that's very clear now, but probably we need to repeat it because it's probably clear for us now, and it's a good news, but few months or 1 or 2 years ago, it was not so obvious to talk about social issue when we were talking about climate issues. So very thank you again, and really thank you to all the participants who have been connecting today, and again to our speakers, and to you, Jean-Jacques, and see you soon, I hope.
Yes, keep safe and have a nice lockdown.
Bye.
Bye.